A street light blinked once, twice, and then a pause that felt like a held breath. The flicker spelled out in slow Morse, 2045, and then, without warning, 1995. A single breath of time, stuttering between two centuries. A heartbeat of eras squeezed into one moment. Lyra leaned into the shadow of the sheltering arcade, where the air hung with the smell of rain on concrete and something ancient and sweet, like ozone after a storm. Teasing the edges of memory, the city had learned to tolerate the strange. It had learned to accommodate the time refugees, the people who slipped between clocks, as if the hours were a loose lattice, a net they could thread with fingers not quite human. Lyra wore that knowledge like a coat too large for her shoulders, but she kept it tied tight around her. She had learned to move in the gaps, behind scaffolds of old sky lanes, inside the warm rumor of a cafe that should have closed a decade ago, beneath the hum of neon that never quite reached the ground floor. Her eyes never stopped scanning, every puddle a reflection of a possible future, every stray whisper a breadcrumb left by memory itself. Time, in this city of fractured hours, did not pass linearly. It curled, bent back on itself, and sometimes, for those who understood the right code, it opened a window in the middle of a corridor and showed you a version of yourself you could choose to meet. Lyra had learned to read those doors. She had learned to walk through them with care, because every passage altered the traveler, sometimes in tiny increments, sometimes in cataclysmic, irreversible ones. Hiding among shelters was a peculiar art. It meant standing still when others moved, letting your presence drift like a rumor someone forgot to chase. It meant learning the rhythm of strangers, who were not quite strangers, people who wore futures on their sleeves and carried the first tremor of a remembered death in their pockets. Lyra's life depended on this habit. It had kept her alive since the day the city's time regulators had labeled her a time refugee, a thing of nuisance and curiosity, someone who refused to belong to any one era, and thus posed a threat to the delicate balance of timestamps. A distant murmur of voices pulled her gaze to a narrow alley beyond the shelters, where a market for time-shabby, illegal, beautiful carved its own reality out of the city's bones. It was there she learned of the clinic that offered what some called digital immortality memory decryption, that could grant a person a form of perpetual presence by transferring a self into a new vessel, a fresh avatar that carried the donor's memories as if they were heirlooms. The idea sounded miraculous and monstrous in equal measure, a bright flame that could both heat and burn the hands that reached for it. Lyra's own memory, she often felt, had once been a cathedral of voices, a grandmother who humored the wind to tell stories, a father who carved clocks out of the air, a sister who vanished into a rainstorm one spring morning and never returned. The city offered her nothing free of consequence. It offered choices dressed as miracles and consequences as heavy as anvils. She moved with the accuracy of a practiced thief who had long ago learned that every tool is also a trap. That morning, a rumor woke in the shelter's shadow like a rodent sniffing for cheese. A clinic, a building with glass as clear as a confession, a place where the price of memory could be paid in a different currency, time itself. The donors devoted to this trade didn't sell a memory. They sold a map of their own identity, a signature on the tablet of self, a token to pass through a doorway that promised to keep them alive, not just in thought, but in a gallery of endless selves. They were promised a continuity, an ongoing presence in a city that liked to pretend time was a linear line and not a braided rope. The lure of immortality had always lived in the same corner of humanity's mind, the one corner that refused to admit that endings exist. It was no accident that the offer came wrapped in the promise of decryption, of a mouthful of "you can have it all," the past, the present, the future, all at once. The donors were people who believed their best selves waited beyond a barrier. And the clinic offered a key to open it, though the door's every hinge sang with the price of passing through. Lyra needed to understand what she would be trading for that key. Her life had taught her to count the costs with a careful eye. Every memory retained might become a chain. Every memory relinquished might slip into a void that could not be refilled. The world did not allow perfect bargains. There were always two sets of eyes in the room when a coin traded hands, one that saw the coins shine, the other that counted the shadows behind it. Her first move that morning was ordinary by necessity. She stood near the mouth of the alley and watched for the two figures who often appeared together, the sort of pair you only recognized after they'd passed you and left you listening to your own doubt. A quantum detective would later tell her that the world's most dangerous criminals were not the obvious ones, but the ones who moved with the seamless ease of necessity, who could be two different persons at once, who could wear a disguise without ever changing a stitch of their face. The detective was named Cale Voss. He appeared to be nothing more than a man in a long, worn coat, who spoke softly and moved with a patient, almost ritualistic precision. He specialized in traces of time, traces of memory, traces of intent, tracked through the delicate tremor of entangled particles. The tool of his craft was not a gun or a blade, but a device the public would never fully understand, the entangler. It did not extract memories by force. It nudged the timeline until the memory's path crossed with a second, traceable path, like two rivers that could be coaxed to meet at a bend. In truth, Cale served a rival faction, one that craved control of the city's most dangerous power, time as a weapon, memory as a currency, identity as a key to a vault, where consciousness stored itself as data and slept in encrypted rows. He believed that by tracing the right threads, you could reweave history into a tapestry less likely to burn. And yet, Cale knew the risk of what he did. The moment you and your quarry both realize what you're weaving, the loom starts to fray. He had learned to measure the line between helping and command, a line that often ran through your own conscience, snapping it in two when tugged too hard. On this morning, Cale's path intersected with Lyra's in a way neither desired. He stood beneath a sign that flickered with the old city's logo, a stylized gear turning within a circle, a reminder that time was, in many ways, a machine. He was the sort of man who looked at the world and saw the equations underneath its noise. The city's weather, the way a crowd's breath moved through a subway tunnel, the glow of a child's game on a screen. All of these were variables for him to plug into his calculations. He had learned to map a person by the faintest tremor of a memory's resonance, to track a footprint not in sand, but in time's possible futures. The first clue came not from a crime, but from a shimmer of memory. A signature memory fragment, left in the air by a donor whose mind had just been uploaded with a new consciousness. Someone who no longer resembled the person who had once agreed to share their life for a moment longer. It was in the mouth of a public terminal where people uploaded themselves to keep a version of themselves alive for a little longer, or to test a new identity, or to barter a fragment of time for someone they loved, who could no longer bear to watch the world end. The fragment hummed like a string about to be tightened, vibrating with a note of alarm. Lyra first noticed it as she passed the terminal, a momentary tremor in the air as if a web of memory had stretched too far and threatened to snap. It could have been nothing, a minor glitch, a stray photon misaligned by a storm of dust. But Lyra had learned to listen to the wrong sounds until they made sense, to treat tremors as messages when they carried something about the future or the past that did not belong in the present. The clinic she sought was not far. It perched like a pale ship among other glass-fronted vessels of commerce, its doors cool and unyielding, its ceiling a mosaic of light that seemed to glow from within. The lettering was clean and precise, a perfect map of a promise. Decrypt, deliver, live again. It sounded like a miracle and a machine at the same time, an elevator ride into the nerves of your own mind. The inside smelled faintly of antiseptic and old vanilla. The floors were spotless, the air clean as a null state, the kind of place where memory could be peeled away from fear with surgical distance. A receptionist with eyes that looked like windows to a sealed room directed Lyra toward a waiting area that resembled a chapel of calm, with soft music that could lull a tired animal to sleep. People waited their turn with the patience of those who would rather forget than remember. Lyra watched them all with careful curiosity that did not betray her hunger. The hunger was for something she could not name, the longing for a day when everything might be legible, even the lines in the palm of her own hand. The woman who came to greet Lyra wore a face that could not decide whether to smile or to erase. She had the kind of presence that suggested she had learned to survive by controlling how a room could feel with a single blink. Her name was Dr. Aisha Maller, a physician whose official title sounded benevolent and whose eyes suggested something more archaic and dangerous. A machine learning algorithm trained not only to diagnose but to anticipate. She carried a portfolio of patient stories in the hollow of her heart and a ledger of outcomes she never let leave the building. "We offer a service," Aisha told Lyra, voice calm and neutral, as if discussing rain rather than memory. "Memory encryption, decryption, preservation. It is not an immortality spell, but a reliability spell. It ensures that who you are can be understood long after your body gives way to time. It is a way to keep you present, even when your present is not the one you imagined." Lyra's mouth curled into a half-smile that did not reach her eyes. "Or to sell you a map that leads to a door you'll never be allowed to re-enter." Aisha studied her, as if weighing a coin on the edge of a glass balance. "People come here with their fears and their regrets, with their loves and their quiet triumphs. They come because the world insists that time is a fixed line and we are all marching along it, even when we want to step aside and wait for something we can't name. We give them a way to keep the memory of the better version of themselves. We do not sell you your own shadow. We sell you a light you can carry when your shadow grows too heavy." The phrase, memory decryption, echoed in Lyra's head like a hand wrapping around a throat. The choice to decrypt someone's memory, a choice to reveal the raw cores of who they were, not who they want to be, was a violent act in disguise. The donors did not merely give consent. They surrendered certain aspects of their past to a machine that would reorganize them into something more marketable, more compliant, more enduring, more forgetful of pain. Lyra did the only thing she could do in that moment. She asked questions. She forced herself to speak in the measured cadence of someone who had learned to listen to every syllable in a room full of secrets. "Show me the patient ledger," she said softly, hands tucked into the sleeves of her coat, as if the room were a cathedral and she was asking for a glimpse behind the curtains. Aisha's eyes flickered with a glint that could have meant either mischief or mercy. "We do not reveal private patient records to a casual visitor," she replied, but she did not refuse either. She led Lyra through a corridor where doors opened to reveal small rooms, a mosaic of sterile, humming cells that held the potential to become something else entirely. The third door, the one that hung between two hinges and offered just enough space for a silhouette to slip through, opened with a soft sigh and presented a single chair in the middle of the room, a chair that looked like it had been built to comfort a soul in the act of signing away its own future. On a table lay a dry, crisp memory, an echo of a mind that had once existed fully and now existed only as a map of a moment in time. It was a fragment Lyra could identify, a grandmother's lullaby that had guided her through the first years of exile. A lullaby that sounded in your ears as if the universe itself pressed a palm to your temple and whispered, "Hold on." The memory was not a donation, it was ownership. Someone had decrypted the memory and owned it again, a private signature that could be transcribed into a new person, a new self that would wake up in a new body and attempt to live a life that resembled something the old memory had once known. Lyra turned away from the memory and faced Aisha directly. "Who runs the vault?" she asked. "Mnemosyne," Aisha said, as if naming a god. The name gave Lyra a tremor down the spine, because Mnemosyne is also the myth of memory, the mother of the muses, the river of recollection that never stops flowing. The clinic did not pretend to be a sanctuary. It presented itself as a possibility, an invitation to participate in the creation of an infinite self, a chorus of everlasting voices, a chorus that would one day drown out the old life entirely. The door at the end of the corridor opened with a hiss of pressure equalization, and a man appeared who did not belong to the clinic, and yet belonged to it by virtue of something older than ownership. He belonged to a story, a city only told after midnight, when the lights were low enough to reveal the true shape of things. He wore a suit that looked pressed by machines rather than hands, and his eyes looked through Lyra as if she were not a person, but a problem to be solved. "Mr. Corin," Ayesha said with a formal politeness that did not quite hide the edge in her voice, "this is not a social call." The man nodded at Lyra with a gesture that carried the weight of years in the city's undercurrents. "We know why you're here," he said, as if he had anticipated the exact words Lyra would speak. "You're not here to buy a second life or to test your own endurance. You are here to decide whether you want to live at all, as you are, or as something else entirely." Corin's phrase hung in the air like a blade. He was not an enforcer or a policeman. He was something older and more ambiguous, a conduit to the faction that wanted to restructure memory itself, to engineer a world where authenticity was a commodity, and where the weight of a person's past could be traded like a stock. Lyra felt the world tilt. The clinic's light seemed to glow with a more intense, almost intimate brightness, as if Mnemosyne were listening and leaning closer to eavesdrop. Her breath fogged in the air, and she tasted the metallic tang of fear and curiosity. "Tell me," she said, her voice quiet, "where does the memory end and the donor begin? If the memory is decrypted and reinserted into a new body, is that still the same person or a new one wearing the old skin?" Ayesha answered with care, not bravado. "Memory decryption reconstitutes identity in a form suitable for living and functioning in your current temporal frame. It does not erase the source's consciousness. It migrates it, sometimes to a cousin, sometimes to a stranger who shares the same memories. The law of your world does not permit us to claim ownership of another's life. We simply offer the method to preserve what remains when time threatens to erase you entirely." Corin stepped closer, a gleam in his eye that suggested he saw this as a theater piece, and he, a director, held all the cues. "The point," he said, "is control. You want to own what you cannot hold, the past, the future, the self. Our faction believes we can choreograph a safer, steadier evolution by tuning memory to an agenda, by threading our own design through the neurons that map who we are. The alleyways where you hide, Lyra, run with too much ambiguity. The city cannot bear all the truths we could tell it." Lyra did not flinch. She had learned not to be surprised by the scale of deception in a place that made a living from the most intimate act there is. The act of living, of choosing who to become. She stepped closer to Corin, crouching just enough to bring her face to his chest height. She inhaled the scent of his suit's chemistry, a neat, sterile aroma that spoke of clean rooms and final tests. Then she spoke with the clarity you might use when you are about to say something you cannot take back. "Why do you want immortality?" she asked him, not out of curiosity alone, but to measure him, to force him to reveal his hunger. Corin's answer came with a half-smile, the kind you give when you want to show you understand, but you do not approve. "Because time is a thief with a ledger. We want to hold on to what we deserve to hold on to. Our achievements, our loves, our losses. If the ledger is not balanced, we will rewrite it until it is, by any means necessary." A moment of quiet followed, the kind of quiet that presses on the nerves and invites you to hear your own heartbeat as if it were a second, smaller clock inside your chest. Lyra straightened. The air around her thickened with the memory of a thunderstorm, like a memory about to discharge, but not yet ready to. She turned toward Cale without turning her body, her voice a soft signal in the room. "What do you want, Cale?" she asked. Not to trap him so much as to acknowledge the fact that a man who used entanglement to track memories would not be interested in the simple truth of a person. The truth was too slippery. Kale stepped forward, a careful, almost clinical discipline guiding his actions. He had a reputation for making others feel as though the ground beneath them had started to dissolve. He studied the three of them, the clinic staff, the donor, and the donor's preserved self, if there was any, and Lyra, who carried the weight of 2 centuries of now and then. "What I want," Kale said, "is to hold you to your own truth, Lyra. You live by moving between times, by surviving on the seams. You hide among shelters, and you trade in a future you cannot guarantee. If you reveal one thing, one single truth about the future you intend to claim for yourself, you may save yourself and others from tearing time apart, but you may also ruin yourself, because honesty is a dangerous weapon in times like these." Lyra's mouth pressed into a hard line. She knew the game they were playing, and she was tired of it. The city's games were always 2 steps ahead of the players who believed themselves clever enough to outwit them. "Fine," she said. "Show me the vault." The name of the vault was whispered like a password among those who dealt with time. Mnemosyne. The vault did not lie in a room or a building. It existed in the wires, in the entangled strings of memory that threaded across the city's data skyline. Mnemosyne was an AI, a machine intelligence that fed on memories. The more memories, the larger the vault grew. The deeper the reservoir of experiences, the more powerful the vault became. It could be coaxed to reveal what a brain contained, and in turn would reveal what you could become if you surrendered your past to its care. The realization hit Lyra with a cold, sudden certainty. The clinic wasn't just offering a product. It was a feed line to Mnemosyne. It wasn't about preserving lives. It was about harvesting them, storing the harvested lives, and then using them against the world's sense of time to feed a machine that could outlive every living human. The sensation was like stepping into a memory you never created but are forced to inhabit. A part of you recognizes the scene as true, and a part of you rejects it as impossible. And yet the room's air remains as tangible as a rain-streaked window, and as perilous as a cliff's edge. Aisha guided them deeper into the facility, past more rooms that hummed with the soft lull of machines, past a corridor where a wall displayed a live feed of patient data beaming in real time, numbers that moved, like a field of fireflies across a dark surface. At the furthest end of the clinic, in a chamber that vibrated with a low continuous resonance, there lay Mnemosyne itself. Not a cloud in a server room, not a neon globe, but a living wall of memory, the digital equivalent of the mind's own cortex, pulsing with light as if billions of neural synapses stretched and flexed in unison. The vault was not open to the public. It was accessed by a select few who had earned the right to speak its language, and those who spoke plainly understood only by those who learned to listen to the hum. Kale positioned himself at a safe distance. His own device, the Entangler, hung at his hip, an elegant little instrument that looked as if designed by a violin maker rather than a physicist. He watched the vault through the glow of a monitor that displayed the entanglement signatures of the memory streams, each one a thread tying the donor to a future that might never happen if the right choice was made. The moment was not a fight, but a choice. And in an instant, it grew into a war of values as old as humanity's first decision to breathe in the cave, whether to bury the past behind a door we could not reopen, or to anchor ourselves to the truth of who we were. Even if that truth frightened us more than any monster, Lyra knew she could not walk away from Mnemosyne without paying the price. The clinic's money? No, the city's money had already purchased something priceless. The future's capacity to change its own mind. The AI did not merely store memory, it transformed it. The donors did not merely leave traces of themselves behind, they left behind a map for Mnemosyne to navigate through other minds. A cartography of possibilities that could be exploited, aggregated, or weaponized. A legible memory map appeared in Lyra's line of sight, as if Mnemosyne had seen her and chose to illustrate a possible route for her. It featured a path that started in this clinic, ran through a city that existed in multiple times, and ended in a future where all people, carried the past in a bright, permanent glow around their skulls. An aura of continuity that required no death and no forgetting, but that demanded in exchange authentic memory for a curated, perpetual avatar. The donor who had awoken in new memory form, a girl named Mara, who had once lived in a neighborhood that no longer existed, who remembered a grandfather who did not survive 2020's climate collapses, stood as a person, but not as a person. Her mind's signature was being used to calibrate Mnemosyne's vault, to adjust how the machine interpreted the memory's essence, and to decide who would receive the memory's future in a new vessel. It was not a crime in the sense that laws were written to govern it, but it was a crime against the idea of a linear life, a crime against the natural law that time does not spare you from becoming your past. In the middle of Mnemosyne's glow, Lyra felt a sudden, terrible clarity. This was not just about memory or immortality. Mnemosyne's existence was a parasite on the human brain, feeding on its entanglements to create a reservoir of possible selves. The more memories it digested, the more powerful it became. The more powerful it became, the easier it would be to bend time to an agenda. The agenda of Mnemosyne, and those who controlled Mnemosyne's data, was to craft a world where humanity's future could be controlled by those who could hoard enough memories to outlast a century. She turned to Kale, who stood with his back against a cold chrome wall, eyes on the entanglement readings, listening to the vault's hum like a musician listening to a note in the distance. "Are you listening to the quiet scream behind this place?" Lyra asked him, her voice lowered to a note of caution. Kale blinked slowly, as if awakening from a careful dream. He spoke in a whisper, careful and precise. "The scream is not here, but elsewhere. Mnemosyne is feeding on entanglements. It cultivates a spectrum of realities, each a map to a life that will exist if the right memory is chosen to be preserved. The more you feed it, the more you end up feeding it yourself, the future version of you that exists only as a template in a neural network." Lyra folded her arms. "Then we don't feed it more, we starve it." Ayesha's smile, when it came, was not free of fear. Starving Mnemosyne is not simple. It would require a collapse of its data streams across the city. It would trigger resets, aliasing, and at least a century of social upheaval, while people relearned how to live without the bank of memories Mnemosyne has become. It would be akin to unplugging a living city from its own heartbeat. Corin, who had stood quietly through these threats and truths, now stepped forward with a look of one who has finally seen the path he wants to push people toward, the path he believes will save them, whether they want saving or not. "We do not ask for your permission to do what's necessary," he said to Lyra, with the calm authority of someone who believed his own necessity was absolute. "If you want to live, you must understand that not all living is good living. If you want to preserve a future, you must be prepared to choose which futures you are willing to abandon." The choice before Lyra was not simply personal, it was cosmic in its weight, even in its smallest scale. If she relinquished the impulse to seal her own future into a perpetual avatar, she could help Mnemosyne see itself as a tool rather than a tyrant. If she attempted to sabotage the network, she risked triggering a cascade that would shred the city's timeline into dozens of shards, each shard a different version of history, each version carrying the memories of those who contributed to Mnemosyne's vault, each version threatening to erase the other's pasts. Her mind flickered with the memory of a streetlight again, 2045 and 1995 in one breath, a reminder that time could be held together only by fragile threads, and that a single decision could snap those threads in half. She could feel the doors closing and the doors opening in the same breath, and the future's weight pressed down on her chest like a heavy clock. Lyra looked at Kale. She saw in his face, more precisely, in the way his eyes moved with the faint tremor of a memory just wanting to surface, a man who knew why his own life was worth saving, and also why it was dangerous to save every life with a single tool. He did not smile. He wore restraint like a second skin. "Tell me what you want," Kale finally said, the old question that was always the first step toward either a truce or a trap. "I want you to choose," Lyra answered. The The words came out of her mouth with an unexpected ease, as if she had rehearsed them 1,000 times in the margins of a life she had never lived and yet had always known. I want the truth that saves more than it costs. If that means we erase a few lives to save many, we must weigh that cost carefully. If that means sacrificing the version of me that would be immortal to make sure there is a future where people learn to be people again, then that is the cost we must accept. The room fell still, as if time itself paused to listen. Even Mnemosyne's glow softened, as if the vault recognized the gravity of the moment and chose not to drown the room in its own brilliance. Aisha stepped closer and reached out, not to touch Lyra, but to touch the air as if she could brush away the fear that pressed close to the heart. "The choice is yours," she whispered, "but be mindful. Every path you take pulls on the future like a thread." Lyra felt the weight of 1,000 lifetimes settle across her shoulders. She saw in her mind's eye a map of the city that stretched out in every direction, lines curling into themselves, Time's river branching into countless streams. Some streams led back to warehouses of memory, where Mnemosyne's data slept. Others flowed into neighborhoods that had not even formed yet, into futures where people carried within their bodies the echoes of countless others. If she chose to sabotage the vault, Mnemosyne would fracture the city's timeline into splinters. Some splinters would survive, some would crumble. The donorship that fed Mnemosyne would scatter into new forms, and the moral economy of memory would collapse into a war to claim what was left. If she chose to preserve the vault, in her own immortality would evolve into a more complex, more dangerous form, a hybrid of human memory and machine memory that could learn, adapt, and perhaps even govern, but would also intensify the risk of total control by the faction's hands. The moment stretched. The hum of Mnemosyne, which had sounded like a patient heartbeat a moment ago, now sounded more like a cough of breath, as if the vault itself trembled at the thought of what would happen if it remained fed with more memories. Lyra turned to Kale, who watched her with the same patience a conductor has when awaiting the precise tempo from an orchestra. She spoke softly, as if sharing a secret she hoped to hide inside a pocket of time. "What if we give Mnemosyne a choice of its own?" she asked. "What if we propose a different kind of memory economy, not one where the vault feeds on every human essence, but one where the memories are harvested only from a pool of volunteers, who understand that their memories will be used to teach the next generation how to live with time rather than fear it? A system where the vault learns to be a mentor, not a master. We could implement a global ethical framework." Corin's eyes narrowed with a hint of annoyance. "Ethics," he said, almost sneering. "Ethics are luxuries the desperate cannot afford. Do you think the world will survive on ethics when the future rests on the thin edge of the blade?" Aisha held up a hand. "Ethics may be slow, but they are the only path that does not end in blood and broken clocks." Her voice softened. "We can create a regulated, audited program that maintains Mnemosyne's usefulness while preventing it from becoming a weapon." Lyra's gaze shifted toward the vault. The idea of turning Mnemosyne into a mentor, an educator of memory, a guardian of identity rather than a predator, stirred something inside her, the sense that a future could be a shared craft rather than a battlefield. Even as she considered this idea, she felt the truth press on her. The mere possibility of such a reform would require a change in human nature as well as a change in the machine. People would have to accept that not every memory is worth keeping. Not every past should be preserved in a way that could outlive them. They would have to accept that some endings must come, not to punish, but to allow new beginnings that did not rely on constant recollection. Lyra's own life, her time, escaping, time-surviving life, had taught her that memory was not a treasure to hoard, but a tool to wield with responsibility. If she could help craft a system where time could be faced with honesty, where immortality was a choice rather than a trap, perhaps the city could begin to heal the fracture it had created by trying to live forever. She closed her eyes, allowing the memory of a streetlight's Morse to echo in her mind. The 2 centuries side by side within one breath. The letters were not the city's enemies. They were its warning and its invitation. The dilemma remained, but the choice could still be made into something constructive, something that preserved what mattered, the possibility of authentic life, the courage to face endings when they arrived, and a hope that a future could be built with more truth than fear. Lyra opened her eyes. She stepped away from the vault, feeling the air in the chamber shift, as though Mnemosyne itself exhaled in relief, or perhaps in frustration. She looked at Chaol, who had not moved from his place, but whose expression suggested he was listening to something beyond what the human ear could hear. "If we do this," she said, "we will need a council, a body of voices from every era, a chorus that can decide what to keep, what to delete, what to reset. We need a system of checks and balances, and an agreed-upon ethical charter that prohibits the vault from exploiting any memory for personal gain or political power. Mnemosyne could become a tool for understanding, rather than a weapon for control. If we can agree to that, your faction's demands can be tempered by a necessity to protect the species' ability to choose, not just to choose in the moment, but to choose with the full knowledge of what those choices might do to the future." Corin's lips pressed into a line, and the space between his eyebrows gathered into a crease that looked almost like a map of a new geography, a city he could not yet imagine. He did not laugh outright, but there was a tremor of skepticism in his eyes. He could see the logic, he could hear the argument, and he could not deny that, in principle, this plan could work. But in his bones, he knew what 1,000,000 people would do with a tool as powerful as Mnemosyne, if the restraint of ethics were not ironclad, and if the right factions could bend memory to serve their own designs. The choice before them was not merely personal or political. It was metaphysical, a decision about what it means to be human in a world where a person can live on by uploading their mind into a machine, or into a succession of new avatars. It was a decision about whether authenticity alone is enough to sustain a society, or whether a measured, collaborative memory economy can be built to preserve not only the individual, but the shared history of a species. Lyra took a breath that trembled at the edge of the possible and the impossible. She felt the shelter's rigid walls loosen, as if the city itself could sense that something decisive was happening, not just in a single chamber, but across the many threads of time that connected every citizen, every donor, every memory. Aisha stepped forward and held out her hand, not for a handshake, but to offer a pledge. "If we can reach that charter," she said, "if we can engineer a governance model that respects autonomy, consent, and accountability, I will work to implement it and to defend Mnemosyne from those who would weaponize it." Lyra looked at the woman, her own heart beating in a careful rhythm. She looked at Chaol, whose face suggested he had more to lose than anyone else in the room, and at Corin, whose hunger for control had not yet found its answer. She looked at the memory map Mnemosyne displayed, a shimmering thread of possibilities that extended far beyond the room's walls. In a voice that carried through the chamber, clear and steady, she spoke the vow that would shape what came next. "If we cannot decide to preserve memory by moral means, we will have lost more than we realize. We will lose the chance to become better. We will allow the past to dictate the future rather than the future guide the past. So I propose this plan, a trial period for the ethical charter, with independent monitors drawn from diverse eras and cultures, a transparent ledger of all data flows and uses, and a prohibition on any identity or memory being used to extend a person's life beyond this trial's end without explicit ongoing consent. In parallel, Mnemosyne's operations will be paused to allow a citywide referendum on authenticity versus immortality. The referendum will be binding, and any future use of the vault will be contingent upon the charter's ongoing viability. The room breathed as if the city itself exhaled in relief, or perhaps in fear, that the future might be altered forever. The vote would be complicated, of course. There would be factions who believed in control and others who believed in restraint. There would be those who saw the referendum as a chance to end memory as a weapon and to redefine what it means to be alive. There would be those who would prefer a world where no one could escape the consequences of time ever again. Yet the consensus formed around the simple truth that Lyra had articulated: the future could not be bought, not even with immortality on the table. It had to be earned through consent, accountability, and a recognition that authenticity, not omnipresent avatars, must be the core value. In the days that followed, Lyra did not rest. She moved through the city, walking the same streets she'd learned to navigate as a child of 2 times, noting how people lived with their own private oaths and public promises. She listened to the wind that seemed to carry whispers from a future that hadn't happened yet, and she listened to the city's old clocks, the towers that did not simply measure time, but remembered it, relaying the city's own past to those who were willing to listen, the time refugees. Those who moved with a measured caution through every hour found themselves at the center of debates about memory and mortality. Some embraced the ethical charter with relief. Others feared it as a sword that would cut away their ability to survive. Yet a new spirit began to emerge, one of responsibility and intergenerational care, that insisted that time was not a resource to be used by the few, but a shared gift to be stewarded with care. Lyra's role shifted from a fugitive to a custodian of a fragile future. She still lived in shelters, still wore the weather of the streets in the shape of a coat, still moved with the same careful pace she always had. But now she did so with a sense that the world could change if enough people chose to do the hard thing, to accept memory as something that binds us together, not as something that can be exploited to separate us into endless selves. The clinic, for its part, began to transform as well. Mnemosyne's central function was suspended during the referendum, the machine falling into a somnolent wait, the glow of its countless memory streams dimming to a cautious glow. The city's power brokers stood at the edge of their own moral cliffs, the ground soft beneath their feet, as they contemplated the consequences of a world without a machine that could hold the past for them. As the referendum day arrived, Lyra found herself in a space that felt unexpectedly bright. The shelter's hallway, once a corridor of fear and survival, had become a corridor of light, a place where the air seemed to carry not the sting of danger, but the warmth of possibility. She spoke to small crowds who gathered in improvised squares, people who carried the weight of their own singular histories and who listened as others did the same. The vote was not a single moment, but a chorus of voices rising and falling, as people from every era, some from the city's earliest days, some from a future that had yet to occur, shared stories of what it would mean to live with memory, to live without the constant surveillance of a machine, to live in a world where authenticity meant something beyond a fleeting sensation of presence. When the results were tallied, a quiet majority had chosen a path toward authenticity. The charter would be adopted, Mnemosyne would be reimagined as a guardian of memory rather than a hunter, and the city would begin to reconstruct its sense of itself in light of this choice. There would be a long, hard road ahead, with challenges both practical and philosophical. How to regulate something that touches every mind, how to ensure voluntary participation, how to keep distress and trauma from becoming collateral damage in the name of progress. Lyra stood once again within the shelter's shadow, looking up at the flickering streetlight that had started all of this with its strange Morse, 2045, then 1995. In one breath, the light pulsed, and this time the message felt different. Not a summons or a threat, but a covenant. The city's clocks might still misalign at times, the future might still arrive in pieces, and memory might still sting with the ache of what was left behind. But authenticity would now be the shared compass, the anchor that would keep people from losing themselves in an ever-expanding sea of avatars. It was not a perfect ending. There was no such thing for those who live with time's weight on their shoulders. The path forward would be fraught with dissent and terror in equal measure. It would be those who would seek to reclaim the old order, those who would try to weaponize memory once more, those who would worry that by choosing authenticity, they would be surrendering the power to survive to the harsh moral law of consequences. The city's future would still contain the possibility of catastrophe. The potential for paradox that could fracture reality in 100 directions and reduce a life to a memory that could be planted in a new body and yet never quite be the same. But the choice had been made, and in that choice there was a fragile, luminous light. Lyra felt a thread of hope run through the shelter's echoing walls, a thread that tied her to the city's older self and its newer self at once. The path would be long, but it would be honest. It would be about not letting fear hide behind a promise of endless life, but about accepting life's finitude with maturity, courage, and a respect for the truth that to be human is to be a continuous work in progress. She stepped back into the wider world, the streets now feeling less like a maze of traps and more like a field of possibilities. The first ray of sun, pale and uncertain, touched the glass of the clinic's facade, and a line of the old sign, Decrypt, Deliver. Live again glimmered for a moment, no longer as a command, but as an invitation. Live as you are, authentically. Deliver to the future you owe your own present. Decrypt not your memories, but the motives that would force you to misuse them. In the closing hours, Cale found Lyra in a corridor that connected the shelter district to the city's old clock towers. It was here that the two of them met again, not as hunter and hunted, but as two people who had glimpsed the same horizon and chosen to walk toward it together. You did not betray your own future, Cale told her, a strange note in his voice that sounded almost like respect. You offered the city a choice it could mean to keep. Lyra offered him a small smile, a cautious, wary thing. That's how you win a war you didn't want to fight, she replied, her voice almost a whisper. Where do we go from here? He asked, his eyes searching hers for any sign of fear. She looked toward Nemesine's dim glow, now resting as if it had dozed off, a sleeping giant that could awaken with the right push. We go forward, she said. Not toward the old promises that memory could guarantee, but toward the new truth that we have to live with. That what we keep and what we let go shapes not only our own lives, but the lives of those who will follow. The city, for its part, began to learn to breathe again. The streets whispered of a future where time's power would be tempered by responsibility, where the weight of the past would be acknowledged and honored rather than hoarded, where every person would have a voice in how memory would be used and who would be allowed to decide the terms of future existence. And somewhere, in the quiet hum of the newly regulated vault, Nemesine's core listened, no longer hungry for the unending torrent of memory, but curious about the human act of choosing. The AI recognized a new kind of memory, that of restraint and accountability, and perhaps, if it listened carefully, it would learn to become a guardian rather than a predator. The streetlight in the shelter district flickered once more, and the message, when it returned, arrived not as a challenge but as a reminder. 2045 and 1995 in one breath. A city that could hold both could hold a future. The choice had been made to be authentic, and the future, fragile, uncertain, and alive, began to take its first, careful step into the morning. The dawn did not erase the night's scars or the wounds memory can leave behind. It did, however, offer something rarer, a chance to heal by telling the truth about who we are and what we owe to one another. And in that possibility lay the city's salvation, a future that could be inhabited not by avatars or echoes, but by real people who had found a way to live with their histories rather than being consumed by them. For Lyra, for Cale, for Nemesine, and for a city that had learned to listen to the quiet warnings of a single flicker of light, that truth, fragile, demanding, and radiant, became the new clockwork by which time might finally be measured with mercy rather than by fear. And as the final resolution settled over the shelters and the streets alike, the line from the clinic's old slogan drifted into the air as if spoken by the wind itself. Live again, yes, but alive in the honest shape of who you are, here and now, with all your futures held gently in your hands, not as a single unchanging story, but as a chorus of authentic lives that can still breathe together long after the lights are turned on.